So let's turn to Jackie Ruff next, who's Vice President for International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon Communications. Could you talk about your perspective from the telecom industry?
Sure. Is this on?
Yep.
Great. So, being here in this conversation, hearing various comments earlier today about what had been done before, what is still valid, and so on, actually took me back. I don't know if Jonathan is still here, but I was at the FCC International Bureau when the U.S. negotiated the Singapore Free Trade Agreement. And it was the first time that we had chapters 13 and 14. We had the telecom chapter and we had the e-commerce chapter. And to think back then, as similar to others who have been up here, that was about 15 years ago that we were discussing, and the internet, e-commerce, those words meant something quite different. But it's very exciting to be here, and I think this Digital 24 is an excellent tool for all the ways that Ambassador Hollyman was talking about it, and that we can also use even outside the trade context in talking with government officials, regulators, etc., as to what is the right policy environment for growth in this area. But let me just talk for a moment about some of the telecommunications or communications provisions in the agreement and highlight those, because when we talk about cloud services, you have to think, how are those data bits getting from, let's say, Malaysia to the cloud to some e-commerce purchaser elsewhere in the world, etc. And we've got a lot of infrastructure there. We've got networks, we've got services, we've even got content that we might think of as communications or telecom that is very much a part of the digital economy. And so I want to highlight three thoughts related to all of that. And of course it's three, right? The first is just to recognize that for those who are in the more classic telecommunications services, or at least have that as part of their business, Verizon is actually much more broadly active, but thinking about that part of our business, actually, when we looked at this agreement and recent agreements, if someone said to us, what's your highest priority, it really is the e-commerce, cross-border data flows, localization of facilities, and also I put the privacy provision in there and talk about the three things at the same time. And I would say I particularly do that when I'm in conversations with government officials. It may not be trade per se, but where I want to talk about this issue, talk about the now 40% of the economy that has agreed on that. It's important to really speak about privacy and the mechanisms for that at the same time as we're talking about the flows on data. And for classic telecom providers, it's of interest that even the networks now are very much IP-based, very much part of they look more and more like the internet network of networks every day. So you talk software-defined networks, virtualized network functionalities, where things that used to happen very close to the person talking on the phone, physical facilities, switching, etc., are now can happen remotely, similar to cloud services, in ways that create efficiencies, equalization of quality available around the world, etc. So these data flow provisions are relevant in that way. I think the important thing to recognize here in TPP, financial services was not covered in our view, needs to be addressed in some way and as quickly as possible. There had also been discussions, you can see in certain conversations or things that have been, documents have been out there, of the possibility of excluding telecom computing facilities, which would have been regrettable, did not happen, thankfully. And I think it's very important to make sure that breadth of inclusion of different kinds of cross-border services continues as we go forward. Secondly, my second main point is just to flag a couple provisions in there that are important to the networks and the provision of supply of services. One is foreign ownership restrictions. There's still a lot of those in telecom, and that can be limiting. There was progress made there. Probably the most important provision in that regard to me is the use of a negative list. Because in our sector, services are evolving. We don't know today what they're going to be, and so if you have the broadest possible coverage, that's the best way to try to include new services. And moreover, classifications, same service might be classified quite differently in different economies. And so our objective would be to try to get the most favorable type of trade treatment for the widest range of services. You might call it one thing in your country, we might call it a different thing in ours, but let's have as much inclusion as possible. Another thing related to being able to have the components to do what you have to do to provide the telecom part is there are important provisions on undersea cable landing stations. You know, most of the data goes over fiber optic undersea cables. There's often a bottleneck at the cable landing station. There are helpful things in there as well as spectrum, choice of technology. And then my final point is regulatory approaches, and there was some conversation about that in the prior panel. What's the relationship between the trade, classic market access, and regulatory approaches? And there is a section in the telecom chapter that acknowledges the need to have to use different regulatory approaches that would give flexibility if there's competition, if there is no need to have something different for consumer protection, or if services are new. And I think in a period when there's so much transformation, so much looking at what will be the rules for Internet of Things, what would be I'm talking about the regulatory rules, not the trade rules, for Internet of Things, for cloud, and so on, to have some high-level principles that can be agreed that say, let's get as much flexibility to promote innovation and investment as we can. So thank you for the opportunity to share those thoughts.